Sarah Mitchell was eating lunch at her desk when her assistant walked in looking confused. The woman said there was someone at the front entrance claiming to be married to their CEO. And security wasn't sure what to do. Sarah set down her sandwich and asked who it was. The assistant didn't recognize her. That should have been the first warning sign that something was very wrong. See, Sarah had been married to David Mitchell for 8 years. David owned Mitchell and Associates, a real estate development company based in Chicago worth about $340 million. They'd met in college, gotten married quietly in Vegas, and kept their relationship private. Nobody at the company knew. Sarah worked in the corporate communications department, and she liked it that way. She didn't want special treatment or people treating her differently because of who she married. The woman at the security desk was tall, blonde, wearing an expensive dress. She told security that David had just proposed to her last night, and they were getting married next month. She wanted to surprise him at work and tell everyone the news in person. The security guard called upstairs to confirm with David. Sarah was still sitting at her desk when her phone rang. It was David. He sounded stressed and told her to come down to his office immediately. She grabbed her bag and headed to the elevator, her stomach already twisting because something felt off about this. When she got to David's office, he was standing by the window with his back to the door. A woman Sarah had never seen before was sitting on the leather couch, scrolling through her phone like she owned the place. David turned around when he heard Sarah come in. His face went pale the second he saw her. The blonde woman stood up and smiled. She introduced herself as Victoria Chen. She said she and David had been dating for 6 months and they were completely in love. She reached for David's hand. David didn't pull away, but he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sarah just stared at both of them. She didn't say anything for almost a minute. Then she asked David what was happening. David started stammering. He said Victoria was, well, she was someone he'd met at a charity event. They'd been spending time together. He kept his eyes on the floor. Sarah looked at Victoria, then back at David. She asked if he was seriously telling her that he was going to marry this woman. David still wouldn't look at her. He said Victoria was the love of his life and he was sorry but he wanted a divorce. Sarah felt her throat close up. She walked out of the office without saying another word. She went back to her desk, packed up her personal things and left the building. She didn't even tell anyone she was resigning. She just left. That night, Sarah was sitting in her apartment in the dark. She kept replaying everything in her mind. 8 years of marriage. 8 years of keeping their relationship secret. And now David was telling the world about Victoria in a way he'd never told anyone about her. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the company's internal social media. Victoria had already been added to the employee directory. Her title was listed as Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, reporting directly to David. Sarah made a decision. She called her divorce lawyer that night and set up a meeting for the next morning. She told him everything. The 8 years of marriage that nobody knew about. The prenup they'd signed, which actually protected her interests pretty well. David's asset value. The fact that this Victoria person had just been given a major executive position at the company. Her lawyer, a man named Tom Richardson, listened to everything and then asked her a simple question. He asked if David had written down anywhere that Victoria was his fiancée. Sarah didn't know. But she realized something immediately. She still had access to the company systems. She was still technically employed because she'd never formally resigned. She could check. Sarah went back to the office the next day. Nobody stopped her. She went to David's office when he wasn't there and looked at his calendar. Nothing about Victoria there. She checked his emails. Nothing official. She checked the HR system. Victoria's employment file showed her start date as 3 weeks ago. There was no marriage license on file anywhere. There was no formal engagement announcement. But here's the thing. Victoria was now sitting at a desk in the executive suite, attending every major meeting, having conversations about the company's future. She was making decisions. She had access to sensitive information about projects worth millions of dollars. Sarah realized that Victoria had somehow convinced David to give her a top position at the company based purely on their relationship. Sarah sent a formal email to the board of directors. She stated that she was David's legal spouse and had been for 8 years. She provided documentation. She said that a woman named Victoria Chen had been hired into an executive position without proper vetting or background checks, apparently based on a romantic relationship with the CEO. She said this created a massive liability for the company. She copied HR and the legal department. The response came within 2 hours. The board requested an emergency meeting. David showed up at Sarah's apartment that evening. He was frantic. He said she'd completely humiliated him in front of the board. He said they'd called an investigation into Victoria's hiring process. He said HR had pulled her background check and found major discrepancies in her resume. She'd never actually worked at 3 of the companies she'd listed. She didn't have the degree she claimed to have. She'd lied about everything. Sarah asked him what he wanted from her. David said he wanted her to retract her statement. He said it was making him look incompetent. He said the board was questioning his judgment as a leader. Sarah told him that wasn't her problem anymore. She said he'd made his choice when he decided to cheat on her and proposed to someone he barely knew. David's hands were shaking. He asked her not to do this. He said his reputation would be destroyed if people found out he'd married someone secretly and then gotten engaged to someone else while trying to hide his real marriage. Sarah looked at him and said that was exactly right. The board called an official press conference. They announced that an internal investigation had found serious violations in the hiring procedures for the vice president position. Victoria Chen had provided falsified credentials and misrepresented her professional background. She was terminated immediately. The board also announced that CEO David Mitchell had requested a leave of absence to address some personal matters. They didn't mention Sarah. They didn't mention the marriage. They just said there had been procedural failures. But the Chicago business community is small. Reporters started digging. Within 3 days, the story broke in the Chicago Tribune. CEO David Mitchell's secret wife had exposed his attempt to cover up an affair with a forged executive hire. The headline was brutal. The article covered everything. 8 years of marriage. The secret kept from everyone. The sudden engagement to a fraudster. The investigation. All of it was out there. Victoria disappeared. She didn't show up for work the day after her termination. The police received a report about the false employment credentials, but pursuing fraud charges against her took months. By then she'd already left Chicago. David agreed to the divorce settlement pretty quickly after that. He didn't want to drag things out any longer. Sarah got a significant portion of his assets, around $85 million plus the apartment and the car. More importantly, she signed an NDA that prevented her from discussing the details of the settlement publicly. But the damage to David's reputation was permanent. The board demanded he take a real leave of absence, not just a few weeks but several months. When he came back, he was no longer CEO. He was demoted to Chief Development Officer. The board brought in an outside CEO to replace him. His salary was cut by more than half. What nobody expected was what happened next. Sarah ended up leaving the corporate world entirely. She took a portion of her settlement and started her own consulting firm, focused on corporate governance and hiring practices. She called it Mitchell & Associates, the same name as David's company. When people asked if it was connected to David, she just smiled and said it was a coincidence. Within 5 years, her firm had become one of the most respected consulting companies in Chicago. She worked with Fortune 500 companies. She became known as an expert in identifying fraudulent credentials and vetting executive hires properly. She was invited to speak at business conferences about ethical hiring practices. David never remarried. He stayed in his lower position at his company for another 3 years before taking a job at a smaller firm in Denver. Sarah occasionally saw his name in business news articles, but they never communicated after the divorce was finalized. The strangest part was that most people in Chicago never actually knew that Sarah was David's secret wife. The news reports had covered the scandal, but they didn't identify her by name in most articles. She was referred to as the CEO's wife. So while Victoria had wanted the world to know she was engaged to David Mitchell, Sarah had spent years trying to keep that secret, and in the end, nobody even knew who she was.